Good afternoon. Somebody's gone to the ice cream social and gotten a little slow. Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm here this afternoon to introduce someone that is a very, very dear friend, and but most importantly, someone who I respect greatly, and that's Spencer Crew. When I was asked to introduce Spencer, I thought, poor Spencer, because what I typically do is share lots of stories about Spencer, but today I will limit myself to one. I'll go ahead and introduce him. Spencer Crew is the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of American, African American, and Public History at George Mason University. He has worked in public history institutions for more than 25 years. He served as president of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center for 6 years and worked at the National Museum of American History Smithsonian Institution for 20. And 9 of those years, he served as the director of the National Museum of American History. And at each institution, he sought to make history accessible to the public through innovative and inclusive exhibitions and public programming. His most important exhibition was the groundbreaking work From Field to Factory, Afro-American Migration from 1915 to 1940, which generated a national discussion about migration, race, and creating historical exhibits. He also co-curated the American Presidency, A Glorious Burden, which is one of the Smithsonian's most popular exhibitions. Now, everybody knows that Spencer is, the Field to Factory exhibition was one that traveled around the country again and again and again until probably it finally just fell apart. They had to create, it was so popular they had to create several traveling smaller versions of it, and really I think people still to this day probably request that exhibition. So Spencer is the perfect person to talk about this subject today. But for me, he is the perfect person because Spencer has always been someone who really wanted to give voice to people who were not the most famous and what many times seemed the most important people. And he started that with his own children. Spencer was always the best father you could imagine. I remember being in Milwaukee with Spencer once, and we were on a panel, and you know how you finish the panel and you think that you got some time to sort of relax and talk with your colleagues. And as soon as the panel was over, Spencer was running out the door because it was his daughter's first day of school, and he had to get back to Washington, D.C. before she got off the bus. He wanted to be there as soon as she stepped off the bus, and he was there. And that was Spencer. That happened again and again. It was that the fact that his children were so important, and you always went like, oh, because and you was really his daughters. There was nothing that he wouldn't do for his daughters. And no matter what you asked Spencer to do, if he could do it, and it did not interfere with his time with his daughters, for him being there at their soccer games, for them to get off the bus on their first day of school or whatever. And he always wanted to make sure that, if you were talking to him and it was time for him to go talk to his daughters. So he's always been a person who wanted to give voice and time to people who maybe in many instances, as we often think of children, are the people that sort of wait. He wanted to make sure that they always had the most important part of himself. So he was the perfect person to really talk about how we, as we go about doing this work in museums, make sure that people who aren't rich, aren't powerful, not famous, always have a voice in the work that we do, and how we make sure that their stories are told and that they are a prominent part of what we do in teaching history, in putting out exhibitions, and in making sure that the public understands the stories of a community, and that community includes people who are not the most well-known people. So I think that is also true in what he did in terms of the work that he did in Field to Factory and what he continues to do, and I know that he shares with his students. And I bet he is the best grandpa in the world as well. So welcome to the stage, the best father, the best grandpa in the world, Spencer Crew.
Thank you.
Did I take your paper?
You did. Oh, okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Okay. I don't have a PowerPoint. You only have me, so I have to see how this goes. Thank you for that tremendous introduction. I don't think my kids would recognize what she's talking about, but that's okay. This afternoon, I do want to talk about giving voice to those who are forgotten, but I want to get at it in a slightly different way than you might expect, and I want to go at this. I was sort of looking at the theme for this conference today, and it's the idea of the social value of museums inspiring change. As I thought about that, my first thought was, what would my students ask me about that if I were to raise that? I've got a student here today. And what I've learned about the students is that they make me think about things in different kinds of ways. And in the course of thinking about this idea of inspiring change, it seems to me that inspiring change is a very noble phrase and a very noble kind of idea and thought that we should follow. But I think you can also follow that in a direction that's not as noble as we might want it to be. And that is because sometimes when we talk about inspiring change, the intent is to encourage people to think the way that we think. Because, of course, we know what's best. So that what we try to do in the work that we present, the programs, the exhibitions, is we want to change them into seeing the world in a way that we think will make the world better. And it's the world that we see it in the way that we operate. And I think we have to be careful about that. Because it seems to me that if, in fact, we are discouraging people from thinking about things differently, from looking at the world differently from the way that we're looking at them, that we're doing exactly the opposite of what we want to accomplish. Because I think that in the world in which we live, change, different points of view, different perspectives is what creates creativity, what creates new kinds of things, which makes the world an interesting place to be. And I think it is a very important part of how we should approach the work that we do and be careful about how we think about this idea of inspiring change. Because without it, things remain the same. Things do not have a new twist and a new perspective. I sometimes think about this idea of change and the importance of it in terms of a movie that I love, and many of you may not know this person I'm talking about, Woody Allen. You've heard of him? There's this wonderful movie that he did that's sort of a variation of the Rip Van Winkle story, which is called Sleeper. And essentially he falls asleep and he wakes up in a future world. And in that future world, the first thing he decides that he's famished and he needs to eat, and his family takes him in and they sit him down to dinner, and what they bring out are all these fatty foods, cholesterol, terrible things. And he said, whoa, wait a minute, you're trying to kill me here. In our world, doctors said this is the worst thing in the world. They said, well, wait a minute. You're in the future now, and they found out that all that is bunk. That in fact, fatty foods, cholesterol are the best things for you to make your life run longer. So it is a new perspective for him. And I think that when we're talking about change, we have to be willing to embrace that. We have to be willing to allow people to see the world differently than we do, to put new ideas forward, and to use those to allow us to grow and to develop. So when you're talking about allowing forgotten voices to come to the forefront, that's exactly what you want to do when you're thinking about change. It's to inspire change, but to inspire it to flow and to move. I would think maybe rather than inspiring change, what we want to do is to embrace change, to embrace it and to make it something that we see valuable, and we embrace it even when it's different from the way that we look at the world. And I think as institutions, the way we can probably do this best is in terms of how we present ourselves to the world of which we want to be a part. How do we present ourselves to our visitors, to our communities, to the people all around us? And I would suggest that sometimes we fall sort of short on that account. It's because the picture we provide, the window into our soul, so to speak, is not one that says we embrace change. Think about it. Look at your web pages. Who is on your web pages? What faces show up on your web pages? What exhibitions show up on your web pages? What objects show up on your web pages? Do they represent a richness of individuals, a richness of stories, a richness of perspectives that say to that first person who makes that connection to you, yes, indeed, this is the place that embraces me, that sees me as a part of what they're trying to do, and is inclusive in its operation? I would dare say that very often that's not the case. I know I've gone to web pages and I've looked at at museums, and I've said, I don't see anyone who looks like me there. Am I sure I want to go there? And part of it harkens back to my own youth, when I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, over near where the cultural centers are. And we would go to those museums on a lot of occasions and really have good experiences. But I went to one day, and I kept wandering in, and there's a lady sitting at the desk, and we're some of the neighborhood kids. And we walk in, and she says, "What are you doing here? What do you want here?" And essentially sort of shooed me out of that place. And luckily, I had parents who sort of had encouraged me to go anyway. But that's the kind of experience that we possibly may be offering to our visitors if our public face, the things that we provide to interact with them, doesn't embrace this idea of change and diversity. That our exhibitions bring in new voices and new perspectives. That our programs do that. And not that these programs and exhibitions are what I call one and dones. You know, it's Black History Month, so we're going to do our Black History Month one. It's Women's History Month. We're going to do our Women's History program. It's Hispanic Heritage Month. We're going to do that. And then we go back to our business as we normally do. I think that is where we run into difficulties and where inspiring change, embracing change, means we have to do things a little bit differently. Part of what it sort of caused me to think about it in this way came from my class. And we were having a conversation about the new National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I asked them, and it's a mixture of people in the class, what would be the most important thing for you when you go to that museum in terms of its having resonant for you? And what they said was they wanted to see people like them. They wanted to feel that it wasn't strange for them to go into that place, that they wouldn't be out of place as a white person going in there, as a Hispanic person going in there, but in fact it's a place where you are invited to be a part of what's going on there. And I think where you see that happening most forcefully is when you hear it and see it in the operation and the words of the leadership of that organization. At the National Museum of African American History, we have Lonnie Bunch there. And from the very beginning, what Lonnie has argued is that that museum is not going to be a museum just for African Americans. What he says, and I love the phrase, is that African American history is an American history, and American history is African American history. They're intertwined, they're connected. So that we have to make sure that the stories we tell embrace all the people who are part of that, not just African Americans, but others. Good stories, bad stories, but a chance for us all to be able to feel that these voices give us a better perspective on the history. John Hope Franklin told him, you've got to make sure you tell all the stories and include all the players in the presentations that you do. So what Lonnie's been very clear about, for all of us who had the opportunity to work for him on some of the exhibitions, is that we have to make sure in these exhibitions that we include all the players who are part of African American history. So that as we do these stories and look into that history, we tell the history of a Frederick Douglass, of a Harriet Tubman, but we also tell the story of a Goodman, or of a Viola Louisa, who was killed after the March on Montgomery. So that all these stories need to be part and parcel of what is shared in the presentations of that museum. But also, he's been very clear about ensuring that that staff represents that diversity and that richness as well. That his staff has a wide variety of people who are connected with it, that the advisory group has a wide variety of people connected with it, that his board has a wide variety of people who are connected with it, so that when you go to that webpage and you look up the players who are there, you see a rich diversity of individuals who are part and parcel of that story. That, I think, is what's important about our institutions, our way of operating, if in fact we're going to inspire or embrace change. That in your operation, you need to in fact have that wide variety of individuals who are part and parcel of that story. That on your board, you need to have a variety of individuals who are there to help tell that story. Many of us tend to do the things that are most comfortable for us, to hang out with people who are like us, hang out with people who agree with us, hang out with people who see the world in similar kind of ways that we do things. That's all well and good, but it doesn't become the kind of thing that allows you to be a place that inspires or embraces change. It's important that at those meetings, especially among the people who are making decisions, who influence policy, who influence decisions about what you're going to do next, that there are a rich variety of people who are there to have that conversation. I've sat on many a board where we've had this conversation with executive officers and the executive committee, that you need to have other players at the table other than people who see the world the same way you do, who look at the world the same way you do. Because what it creates is it creates change. It creates diversity. It creates a richness of perspective that allows you to think about things in new kinds of ways, that pushes you to areas where maybe you're not comfortable, but that actually will work to the advantage of your institution if you want to be connected directly to that community, to that world of which you are a part. It's not a comfortable thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. But I think the idea of allowing other voices to be a part of that conversation is really important. I know that when I'm sitting at meetings with individuals, I have a wife and I have a daughter. I don't know what it means to be a woman. I need to have someone with that perspective there in the conversation. I know that when I was at American History, when I first started director there, I came under attack by the Hispanic community. And I couldn't figure out why. I said, I'm a brother, you know, I understand what's going on here, we'll be okay. And they said, no, you don't. That in fact, you need to have a different point of view helping you to see how to tell that story better, how to enrich the story of American history in a much more powerful, sensitive kind of way. And so what we had to do was to make sure we included more individuals. We created an advisory group. We brought people onto the board. The idea was that you need to have that richness, that diversity as part and parcel of the conversation, no matter who you are. And that diversity, that richness is widespread in how we think about it. Part of it's the issue of color. Part of it's the issue of gender. Part of it's the issue of ethnicity. There are all kinds of ways, economic situation, all kinds of ways in which this diversity has to be considered. If we do that, I think that we have an excellent opportunity to be places that are, in fact, valued and held to be important by those who are around us. If we don't do that, I think we're going to find ourselves being less and less relevant in the communities of which we want to be a part. It's just a simple thing to do is to look at the demographics. I missed the presentation this morning, but I understand it was a good conversation about diversity. And a comment was made that, in fact, if you want to be cognizant of where you need to head, you need to read the census report. And it seems to me that makes a lot of sense. That if the community around you is changing, you need to make sure that that community is represented and an integral part of what you're doing. If you do that, then in fact, you will include, as part of the work that you do, these forgotten voices that we've started this conversation about. Making sure that their stories, their objects, their ideas are part and parcel of what we're doing. Because what our places do, whether we want to embrace that or not, is that what we show, what we highlight, sort of signifies what we think is important to know. At history museums, what's important to remember, and what should be codified into the richness of American history and life. And if you are including these other stories, these other individuals, it says to them, your story is important too. What you have to offer helps to shape and enrich this culture and this history in important kinds of ways. When we don't do that, we're saying to them, in fact, we don't think that what you're doing is important, but what you've contributed has worthwhileness to what we're trying to do. We can't afford to do that. The world is changing, I think, too dramatically. The world is looking for places where they can find themselves. And if we, in fact, can embrace that, if we can, in fact, be a force for change in the sense of opening ourselves up, and through example saying, yes, we're looking for different kinds of things. We're looking for what you can bring to the table, because that will not only make us better, but hopefully will make our community better. It'll make connections much stronger. So what I'd like to conclude by saying is that, yes, it's important that as a group of institutions that we are trying to inspire or to embrace change. But if we're going to do that, we have to do more than use the words. We have to, in fact, embody that. We have to illustrate it dramatically in all the things that we do, the objects, the exhibitions, the programs, but most importantly, the staff, the board, the executive group. If we begin to do that, I think then the idea of inspiring or embracing change becomes a truism for who we are. If we don't do that, I think it only becomes a set of hollow words that people look at us and say, they're saying it, but I don't see what they're doing. It's important to walk the walk as much as to talk the talk. Thank you.